It was the year 1653. Westminster Palace, London. The long chamber of Parliament murmured like a disturbed beehive. The air was thick and oppressive, saturated with the acrid smells of hundreds of unwashed bodies, tobacco smoke, melted candle wax, and an old, almost tangible hostility that had lingered here for years. Beyond the tall Gothic windows, a capricious April day shifted restlessly between brief flashes of sunlight and sudden downpours. Yet inside the very heart of English power, a far more terrible storm was about to break. For more than 10 years, this room had been the main stage upon which the fate of the nation was decided. Here, fiery speeches lasting for hours had reshaped history. Here, laws were forged that shook the foundations of the European order. And here, in this very hall, the death sentence had been pronounced upon God's anointed king, Charles I. But today, all of this was coming to an end. In the center of the chamber stood a man dressed in a plain black woolen doublet, without a fashionable wig or lace cuffs. His face was rough and weathered, frozen in an expression of grim determination. His eyes, usually heavy and contemplative, now burned with a cold, steely fire. This was Oliver Cromwell, Lord General of the army of the new state, conqueror of kings, a man whose name had already become a legend to some and a curse to others. He listened to the parliamentary debates, and with every passing minute his expression darkened. Before him he no longer saw fathers of the nation or pious men, but a gathering of self-serving politicians, lawyers, and profiteers clinging to power they no longer deserved. They had betrayed the revolution. They had betrayed God. And he, Oliver Cromwell, had come to be the instrument of divine judgment. Suddenly he stepped forward. The buzzing in the hall faded. Hundreds of heads turned toward him. The silence was shattered by his harsh, thunderous voice, a voice accustomed to commanding armies on battlefields, rising above the roar of cannon fire. "Enough," he growled. "I will put an end to your prattle." With these words, he tore off his hat and began pacing the chamber, hurling a torrent of furious accusations at the stunned members. He denounced them for drunkenness and debauchery, for nepotism and injustice, for endless delays and greed, for turning God's great cause into a pitiful farce. "You are no more Christians than my horse!" he shouted, his voice filled not merely with anger, but with profound contempt. Then his gaze fell upon the massive speaker's chair and the ceremonial mace lying before it, the ancient symbol of parliamentary authority. Cromwell's face twisted with disgust. "What is this bauble?" he roared, pointing at it. "Take away this foolish trinket." At the doors appeared the grenadiers of his personal regiment, muscular veterans in red coats, who had followed him through fire and blood from Marston Moor to Worcester. The parliamentarians, who only moments ago had ruled the fate of England, froze in silent terror. History held its breath as one man, driven solely by his will and an unshakable faith, dissolved the oldest representative body in Europe. On that day, the Republic died, giving way to the rule of a single individual. But who was this man? A holy warrior or a bloody tyrant? A liberator of the nation or its usurper? To understand this, we must return to the past, to the turbulent and mist-shrouded era that gave birth to the greatest schism in English history, and to a quiet provincial landscape where, far from the glitter of court life, a boy was growing up who was destined to execute a king and become an uncrowned monarch himself. His name was Oliver Cromwell. Before we turn to the life of our main character, we must first paint the backdrop of the age upon which his figure would emerge in all its tragic and monumental complexity. Early 17th century England was a time of deep tectonic tensions, concealed beneath a deceptive surface of peace and prosperity. A new dynasty sat upon the throne, the Stuarts, who had come from proud and untamed Scotland. Their first representative, James I, brought with him ideas profoundly alien to English political tradition. England, unlike powerful continental monarchies such as Spain or France, had never known absolute monarchy in its pure form. Since the signing of the Magna Carta in 1215, forced upon King John by rebellious barons, the idea had taken root that royal power was not unlimited. It was restrained by law and by the rights of subjects, represented in Parliament. Parliament, composed of the House of Lords, hereditary aristocracy and senior clergy, and the House of Commons, elected from the gentry and wealthy townsmen, possessed one fundamental and inviolable right: the approval of taxation. A king could rule, wage war, appoint ministers, but whenever he required funds beyond his ordinary income from crown lands and customs, he was compelled to summon Parliament and negotiate. This financial dependence of the Crown upon Parliament became the cornerstone of English liberty and, as it would soon prove, the primary source of future conflict. James I, and later his son Charles I, saw matters very differently. James, the son of the tragic Mary, Queen of Scots, was an experienced Scottish monarch who had written an entire treatise on the divine right of kings. He and his son sincerely believed that their authority was granted directly by God and that they were accountable only to Him. In their eyes, Parliament was not a partner in governance, but an inconvenient relic of a feudal past, an obstacle to be subdued or eliminated. Charles I, who ascended the throne in 1625, was a man of a very different temperament than his father. Where James had been clumsy, talkative, and coarse, Charles was a refined aesthete, a lover of painting who assembled one of Europe's finest art collections. He was a devoted family man, deeply religious, and impeccably mannered. Yet as a politician, he was disastrous, proud, stubborn, secretive, and utterly incapable of compromise. He regarded any opposition to his will as a personal insult and a sign of rebellion. From the very beginning, his reign became a prolonged struggle with Parliament over two central issues: money and religion. The religious landscape of England at the time resembled a minefield. After the Reformation under Henry VIII, who broke with Rome for personal and political reasons rather than theological ones, the Anglican Church became the official faith. It was a hybrid institution, retaining many Catholic rituals, liturgy, and episcopal hierarchy, while rejecting the authority of the Pope. Yet a powerful movement arose, seeking to purify the Church of what they saw as papist remnants. They were called the Puritans. Puritanism was not a single doctrine but a broad spectrum of beliefs united by one idea: that life, church organization, and the state itself must be structured strictly according to the Word of God as revealed in the Bible. Puritans rejected ornate rituals, icons, stained glass, luxurious vestments, and the authority of bishops. They preached strict morality, diligence, modest living, and personal responsibility before God. For them, the Bible was not merely a sacred text but a complete manual for daily life. At the core of their worldview lay the severe doctrine of predestination articulated by John Calvin, the belief that God had chosen, before the creation of the world, some for salvation and others for eternal damnation. One could never know one's fate for certain, but worldly success achieved through honest labor, a righteous life, and sincere faith were seen as signs of divine favor. This belief shaped a particular type of personality: energetic, disciplined, resolute, utterly convinced of its righteousness and prepared to go to any lengths to defend its faith. Charles I and his chief ecclesiastical adviser, Archbishop of Canterbury William Laud, saw Puritanism as a direct threat to order and royal authority. If priests and bishops were unnecessary for salvation, then what purpose did their hierarchy serve, a hierarchy at whose summit stood the king himself? Laud initiated reforms aimed at standardizing worship, reintroducing elements that Puritans considered idolatrous. Altars were moved to the eastern end of churches and enclosed by rails. Organ music was restored, and kneeling during communion was enforced. For thousands of Englishmen, this was not merely a matter of ritual. It was the advance of the Antichrist, a creeping Catholic restoration. Suspicions were deepened by the fact that Charles's wife, the French Princess Henrietta Maria, was a devout Catholic who openly maintained Catholic priests at court. Across the country, from London to the most remote villages, a quiet resentment grew in the hearts of merchants, craftsmen, farmers, and, most importantly, the lesser gentry. They watched as the king trampled ancient rights, attempted to rule without parliament, and imposed a foreign, papist faith upon them. The atmosphere thickened. England stood on the brink of explosion. And it was within this environment, at the very heart of Puritan England, that Oliver Cromwell would rise. Yet while storm clouds gathered over the capital, life continued calmly in the quiet, marshy lands of eastern England known as the Fens. On April 25, 1599, in the town of Huntingdon, a boy named Oliver was born to Robert Cromwell and Elizabeth Stuart. His origins were modest but respectable. He belonged to the gentry, the lesser landed nobility that formed the backbone of the English countryside. These men held no great titles or vast fortunes, but they were independent landowners, served as local magistrates, sat on juries, and most importantly, were elected to the House of Commons. They were the foundation of local authority and the voice of public opinion. The Cromwell family had once been influential. Oliver's great-grandfather, a Welshman named Morgan ap Williams, had married the sister of Thomas Cromwell, the powerful and ruthless minister of King Henry VIII and architect of the English Reformation. It was Thomas Cromwell who oversaw the dissolution of the monasteries, and his relatives grew wealthy on former church lands, adopting his prestigious surname. By the time Oliver was born, however, the family's glory had faded. His father, a second son, inherited only a small estate yielding a modest but stable income of £300 a year. Oliver's childhood resembled that of thousands of boys of his class. He received his early education at the Huntingdon Grammar School under the guidance of the Puritan preacher Thomas Beard. There he studied Latin, read ancient history through Plutarch, and above all, immersed himself daily in the Scriptures. The Bible, especially the Old Testament with its harsh tales of prophets, judges, and warriors leading God's people, became his lifelong companion. He grew into a strong, physically robust youth, fond of horseback riding, hunting, and rough masculine pastimes. Contemporaries described him as impulsive, quick-tempered, and prone to bouts of deep melancholy, which he himself called contemplation. Even then, a great inner force could be sensed beneath his outward simplicity and roughness. In 1616, at the age of 17, Oliver entered Sidney Sussex College, Cambridge, a deliberate choice, as the college was known as a centre of Puritan thought. It was here that his worldview took shape. He was not a brilliant student, and studied there for only a year. The death of his father in June 1617 forced him to return home and assume responsibility for the family. He was only 18. Over the following years, he likely spent time in London studying law at one of the Inns of Court, a customary path for gentlemen involved in public life. In 1620, he married Elizabeth Borgia, the daughter of a wealthy London leather merchant with strong Puritan connections. This marriage was not only one of affection, all evidence suggests a deep and enduring bond, but also a socially advantageous union that strengthened his position. They would have 9 children, and Cromwell immersed himself in the life of a rural squire. He managed his estate, took part in local affairs, and raised his family. His destiny seemed set, a quiet, unremarkable life like that of his father and grandfather. Yet storms raged within him. In the late 1620s, Cromwell experienced a profound spiritual crisis. He later described it as a time of darkness and despair. He saw himself as the chief of sinners, plagued by depression, hypochondria, and fear of eternal damnation. He sought medical help for imagined illnesses and turned desperately to scripture and prayer. Around 1630, he underwent what Puritans called a conversion, a rebirth. He felt that God had forgiven him, that his sins were washed away by Christ's blood, and that he was chosen for salvation. This experience transformed him completely. Melancholy gave way to an unbreakable, almost fanatical certainty. He came to believe that he was an instrument of providence, and that all his actions were guided directly by God's will. This conviction would become the source of his immense energy, determination, and, at times, ruthless severity. He was no longer merely a man. he had become an instrument of God. While Cromwell found his faith, the nation sank deeper into crisis. In 1628, as the conflict between Charles I and Parliament reached its peak, new elections were held. Oliver Cromwell, a 30-year-old squire scarcely known beyond his county, was elected to the House of Commons for Huntingdon. It was his first step onto the national stage. The Parliament of 1628 was among the most turbulent in English history. Outraged by the King's arbitrary rule, forced loans, imprisonments without trial, the Commons passed the famous Petition of Right, drafted by the great jurist Sir Edward Coke. It reaffirmed fundamental liberties: no taxation without parliamentary consent, no imprisonment without charge, no billeting of soldiers in private homes. Cromwell played a minor role in this session. He delivered only one speech, but a revealing one. Rather than attacking royal policy, he condemned a bishop whom he accused of preaching shallow papism. Even then, it was clear that for Cromwell, religion and politics were inseparable. In his eyes, the struggle for parliamentary liberty was part of a far greater battle, the defense of true faith against the forces of Antichrist. Charles I was forced to give his assent to the Petition of Right. Yet before long, he found a way to bypass it. In 1629, weary of the defiance of the House of Commons, he dissolved Parliament and began the period known as the 11 Years' Tyranny, or personal rule, a time when the king attempted to govern as an absolute monarch. To refill the treasury, he revived long-forgotten feudal levies. He fined nobles who had failed to appear at his coronation to receive knighthood, sold monopolies, expanded the boundaries of royal forests in order to impose penalties for their use. The most hated of all taxes became ship money. Traditionally, this levy had been imposed only on coastal towns to fund the navy in times of war. Charles, however, extended it to the entire country during peacetime. This provoked widespread outrage, as it was a direct violation of the Petition of Right. For Cromwell, these 11 years marked a return to private life, though it was far from peaceful. Due to property disputes, he was forced to sell his estate in Huntingdon and move to the nearby town of St. Ives, where he leased a farm. His social standing declined. He effectively ceased to be a landowner and became a tenant farmer. Yet it was precisely during this period that he earned a reputation as a defender of ordinary people. He led a protest by local farmers against a project to drain the marshlands known as the Fens. The scheme was supported by wealthy landowners and the Crown, but it deprived thousands of poor villagers of their traditional rights to graze livestock, fish, and cut peat. Cromwell did not fear confrontation with the powerful, and this earned him the nickname Lord of the Fens, and great popularity among common folk. In 1636, fortune smiled upon him once again. He received a substantial inheritance from his maternal uncle and moved to the city of Ely, becoming a wealthy man and one of the principal collectors of church tithes in the region. Yet throughout these years, he, like many other Puritans, watched events in the country with growing anxiety. Archbishop Laud's religious policies grew ever more severe. Puritan preachers were stripped of their offices, their books burned, and they themselves subjected to humiliating punishments, placed in the pillory, branded, and mutilated. It seemed that England was inexorably drifting toward tyranny and popery. Many, in despair, emigrated to America, founding colonies in New England. According to some accounts, Cromwell himself considered emigration, but Providence had prepared a different fate for him. The spark that ignited the powder keg came from Scotland. In 1637, Charles I and Laud attempted to impose a new English-style liturgy upon the Presbyterian Church of Scotland. The Scots, who cherished their austere faith even more fiercely than the English, perceived this as a declaration of war. When the new prayer book was first used in St. Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh, the congregation erupted in riot, allegedly sparked by a stool thrown by a market woman named Jenny Geddes. Rebellion spread throughout Scotland. Tens of thousands signed the National Covenant, pledging to defend their faith to the last drop of blood. To suppress the uprising, Charles needed an army, and for an army, he needed money. After an 11-year hiatus, he had no choice but to summon Parliament once again. In April 1640, the so-called Short Parliament convened. Oliver Cromwell was elected once more, this time as a member for Cambridge. He travelled to London not as a novice, but as a seasoned 40-year-old man, hardened by adversity, armed with unshakable faith and a reputation as a champion of justice. He did not yet know that this session would be only a prologue to the great drama in which he was destined to play the leading role. The peace the king had long hoped for did not materialize. The short parliament lasted just 3 weeks. Instead of voting funds for war against the Scots, the House of Commons, led by experienced figures such as John Pym and John Hampden, inundated the king with grievances about 11 years of tyranny. Enraged, Charles dissolved this parliament as well. But his position was now desperate. Having assembled a poorly trained and reluctant army, he suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of the Scots in the Second Bishops' War. The Scottish army invaded northern England, occupied Newcastle, and demanded a massive indemnity of £850 per day until a final settlement could be reached. The treasury was empty. In November 1640, Charles, gritting his teeth, summoned a new parliament. This assembly would go down in history as the Long Parliament. It would exist, in one form or another, for nearly 20 years and would transform England forever. Oliver Cromwell was again among its members. This time, he had no intention of remaining silent. A royalist member of Parliament, Sir Philip Warwick, left a vivid description of Cromwell's appearance during this period. "I saw a gentleman very plainly dressed. His linen was plain and not very clean. His hat was without a band. His sword hung close to his side. He was very eloquent, though he spoke with passion, and his temperament seemed fiery." Cromwell plunged headlong into parliamentary work. He became one of the most active members, serving on numerous committees. His speeches were impassioned, sometimes disjointed, but always filled with sincere outrage against tyranny and popery. He was among those known as the root and branch men, those who demanded not mere reform, but the complete abolition of the episcopal system in the Church. The first 2 years of the Long Parliament marked the triumph of the opposition. Parliament secured the arrest and subsequent execution of the king's most hated advisers, the Earl of Strafford and Archbishop Laud. All illegal taxes, including ship money, were abolished. The Triennial Act was passed, requiring the king to summon Parliament at least once every 3 years, along with a law stating that Parliament could not be dissolved without its own consent. It seemed the revolution would be bloodless. But Charles I had no intention of surrendering. He merely waited for the right moment to strike back. Tensions reached their peak in the autumn of 1641, when a brutal Catholic uprising erupted in Ireland against English and Scottish Protestant settlers. Horrific rumors spread across England, speaking of the massacre of tens of thousands of Protestants. The numbers were wildly exaggerated, but it no longer mattered. Panic and anti-Catholic hysteria seized the nation. Parliament was ready to raise an army to suppress the rebellion, but a crucial question arose: who would command it? Traditionally, the king was commander-in-chief. But could the House of Commons entrust an army to a monarch whom it suspected of collusion with Irish rebels, and of intending to use that army against Parliament itself? The opposition leaders, headed by John Pym, took a radical step. They drafted the Grand Remonstrance, a lengthy document listing more than 200 grievances detailing abuses of royal power since the beginning of Charles's reign. It was no longer merely a bill, but an appeal to the people over the king's head. After fierce debates lasting deep into the night, the remonstrance passed by a narrow margin of just 11 votes. When one member asked Cromwell what he would have done had the document failed, he reportedly replied, "I would have sold all I had the next morning and never seen England again." Charles's response was desperate and reckless. On January 4, 1642, he personally entered the House of Commons, accompanied by 400 armed soldiers, to arrest 5 of its leaders, including Pym and Hampden. But they had been warned and escaped by boat along the Thames. The king entered the chamber, took the speaker's chair, and, finding his enemies gone, uttered the famous words, "I see the birds are flown." This act was an unprecedented violation of parliamentary privilege. It destroyed the last remaining bridges. London erupted in unrest. The citizens rose in defense of Parliament. The king was forced to flee the capital and travel north, where he began gathering his supporters, the Cavaliers. Parliament, in turn, began forming its own army of supporters known as the Roundheads, so called for the Puritan fashion of short-cropped hair. In August 1642, Charles I raised his royal standard at Nottingham. It was a formal declaration of war. The English Civil War had begun. Oliver Cromwell, now 43 years old and with no prior military experience, immediately returned to his home county. Using his own funds, he raised a cavalry troop from among his Puritan neighbors. He acted with astonishing energy and determination. While others debated and hesitated, he acted. He seized control of the arsenal at Cambridge Castle and intercepted a shipment of silver plate that the colleges were sending to the king. He understood that this was not a war for political privilege, but a holy war, and that victory required not mercenaries or aristocrats, but men who knew why they fought. In one of his letters he expressed his creed. "I would rather have a plain russet-coated captain that knows what he fights for and loves what he knows, than that which you call a gentleman and is nothing else." It was a simple yet revolutionary idea, one destined to create the most formidable army in Europe and to raise its creator to the heights of power. The first phase of the war brought no decisive victory to either side. Although Parliament's army was larger and better funded, controlling London and the wealthy southeast, it suffered from serious flaws. It was commanded by aristocrats such as the Earl of Essex and the Earl of Manchester, who waged war cautiously and indecisively. They sought compromise rather than total victory, hoping to preserve both the monarchy and their own privileges. The soldiers were poorly trained and lacked fighting spirit. The first major battle, at Edgehill in October 1642, ended in a draw. Cromwell, who fought as a captain, witnessed firsthand the devastating superiority of the Royalist cavalry, commanded by the charismatic and audacious Prince Rupert of the Rhine. His horsemen swept everything before them, yet after their initial success, they scattered to loot the baggage trains, losing cohesion and command. Cromwell learned quickly. He realized that the key to victory lay in disciplined, ideologically motivated cavalry. Returning to eastern England, he set about forming his own regiment with renewed vigor. He selected men not by birth, but by religious zeal and fighting ability. His soldiers were yeomen, free farmers, craftsmen, ordinary men, committed Puritans who saw the war as a struggle of Christ's army against the forces of Antichrist. He enforced iron discipline. Drunkenness, gambling, and blasphemy were punished harshly. Yet he treated his men with paternal care, knew many by name, and prayed with them. Before battle, his regiment sang psalms. These warriors, clad in cuirasses and helmets and fanatically devoted to their commander, soon earned the name Ironsides. Cromwell's talent as a cavalry commander quickly became evident. His Ironsides repeatedly crushed Royalist detachments in skirmishes. He developed a new tactic, unlike that of Prince Rupert. After striking the enemy, Cromwell trained his riders to regroup immediately, maintain formation, and deliver a second crushing blow against the flanks or rear of the opposing infantry. This discipline and control made his cavalry the decisive force on the battlefield. Cromwell's finest hour, and that of his Ironsides, came on July 2, 1644, at the Battle of Marston Moor, the largest engagement of the war. The Parliamentary army, joined by its Scottish allies, faced the Royalist forces under Prince Rupert. Cromwell commanded the cavalry on the left flank. Early in the battle, he was wounded in the neck, but after hastily binding the wound, he returned to the fight. His charge shattered the Royalist cavalry opposing him. Then, instead of pursuing the fleeing enemy, he executed his signature maneuver, wheeling his squadrons around and striking the rear of the Royalist infantry, which at that moment was pressing hard against the center of the Parliamentary line. This blow decided the outcome of the battle. The victory was complete. The north of England fell into the hands of Parliament. Oliver Cromwell's name thundered across the entire country. It is said that after the battle Prince Rupert gave Cromwell the nickname, Old Ironsides. Despite this triumph, the overall situation remained uncertain. In the south, the commander of the Parliamentary army, the Earl of Manchester, Cromwell's immediate superior, acted passively and missed several opportunities to destroy the king's forces. By that time promoted to lieutenant general, Cromwell openly accused him in Parliament of lacking the will to bring the war to a decisive conclusion. "If we fight like this," he declared, "the war may drag on for 20 years. Fierce debates erupted in Parliament. Cromwell and his supporters, the so-called war party, demanded a fundamental reorganization of the army. They understood that victory required a unified, professional national army, subordinate to central command and modeled on Cromwell's own regiments. The result of this struggle was the adoption of two revolutionary acts. The first was the Self-Denying Ordinance, under which all members of Parliament, both Lords and Commons, were required to resign their military commands. Its purpose was to remove indecisive aristocratic politicians from the army. The second was the creation of the new model army. This was the first regular army in English history, maintained on permanent state pay. Its commander-in-chief was appointed Sir Thomas Fairfax, a brave and capable general, while Oliver Cromwell became commander of all cavalry, an exception being made for him to the Self-Denying Ordinance due to his indispensable military talents. The creation of the new model army marked a turning point in the war. It numbered about 22,000 men, infantry dressed in red coats, which would later become a tradition of the British Army, and cavalry. But its main strength lay in its spirit. Puritan preachers sustained the soldiers' exceptionally high morale, convincing them that they were warriors of the Lord. The army became not only a military force, but also a powerful political and religious corporation, bound together by a shared ideology and loyalty to its commanders. Soon this army was to face its greatest test. The decisive battle of the First Civil War took place on June 14, 1645, near the village of Naseby in central England. The new model army under Fairfax and Cromwell confronted the last major army of King Charles. The forces were roughly equal, about 10 to 12,000 men on each side. The battle unfolded according to a familiar, almost tragic pattern for the Royalists. On the right flank, Prince Rupert's cavalry, as at Marston Moor, attacked and routed the parliamentary cavalry commanded by Cromwell's son-in-law, Henry Ireton. As always, Rupert, carried away by the pursuit, chased the enemy toward the baggage train and was absent from the battle for a long time. On the opposite flank, Cromwell and his Ironsides attacked the Royalist cavalry and, after a stubborn fight, put it to flight. Unlike Rupert, however, Cromwell did not pursue the fleeing enemy. Leaving a small detachment to complete the rout, he wheeled his main force and struck the flank and rear of the royal infantry. The king's foot soldiers, veterans of many battles, fought with desperate courage, but found themselves trapped. From the front they were attacked by Fairfax's disciplined infantry, and from the flank and rear by Cromwell's cavalry. Seeing his infantry being destroyed, Charles I attempted to lead his last reserve into battle. But one of his attendants, a Scottish lord, seized the reins of the king's horse and led him from the field, saving his life, saying, "Will you go upon your death?" This decided the outcome of the battle. The royal infantry was surrounded and almost completely destroyed or taken prisoner. The victory at Naseby was absolute. The king's army effectively ceased to exist. Even more importantly, the parliamentarians captured Charles's personal baggage, which contained his secret correspondence. It revealed that he had been negotiating with Catholic powers in Europe and even with Irish rebels, seeking their help in the war against his own people. For the Puritans, this was the final proof of his treachery. Trust in the king was destroyed completely. Over the following year, the new model army methodically crushed the remaining pockets of royalist resistance. In May 1646, Charles I, realizing the cause was lost, fled besieged Oxford and surrendered to the Scottish army stationed in England. The First Civil War was over, but victory gave rise to new and even more complex problems. What was to be done with the king? How was England's future to be shaped? The victors immediately split. The majority in Parliament, the so-called Presbyterians, sought compromise. They wanted to disband the army, which they saw as too radical and expensive, restore Charles to the throne with limited powers, and establish a Presbyterian church system in England modeled on Scotland's, with a national synod and strict hierarchy. The army categorically opposed this. Soldiers and officers who had shed blood for freedom were not prepared to exchange royal tyranny for the tyranny of presbyters. Strong positions within the army were held by the independents, who supported the independence of each congregation and broad religious toleration for all Protestants. Moreover, an even more radical movement emerged within the army, the levelers, or equalizers. They demanded not only religious but political democracy, universal male suffrage, the abolition of the House of Lords, and the proclamation of popular sovereignty. Their leader was the charismatic publicist John Lilburne. Cromwell found himself in a difficult position. As a member of Parliament, he was obliged to obey its decisions. As Lieutenant General of the Army, he was one of the soldiers and shared many of their beliefs. He tried to act as a mediator between army and Parliament, but the gulf between them continued to widen. When Parliament voted to disband the army without paying several months of arrears, the soldiers' patience snapped. In June 1647, the army mutinied. A cavalry detachment seized King Charles from parliamentary commissioners, effectively taking him hostage. The army marched on London, and Cromwell, after some hesitation, made his choice. He left Westminster and joined his soldiers. From that moment on, the army became the dominant political force in the country. In the autumn of 1647, the famous Putney debates took place in a church in a London suburb. Army grandees, senior officers including Cromwell and his son-in-law Henry Puritan, debated with representatives of the soldiers, the leveller agitators. It was a unique moment in history. Ordinary soldiers argued on equal terms with their generals about the future structure of the state. The levelers presented their draft constitution, the agreement of the people, based on ideas of universal equality and human rights. Cromwell and Puritan, though sympathetic to many of these ideas, regarded them as too radical and dangerous to the sacred right of property. The debates reached a deadlock, but they demonstrated how far the revolution had progressed. Meanwhile, the captive king was far from idle. He conducted secret negotiations with all sides simultaneously, with Parliament, with the army grandees, and most importantly with the Scots. In December 1647, he concluded a secret treaty with Scottish commissioners, promising to establish Presbyterianism in England for 3 years in exchange for military assistance. In the spring of 1648, royalist uprisings flared across England, and a Scottish army invaded from the north. The Second Civil War had begun. For the army and for Cromwell, this was treachery. They had negotiated with the king, seeking compromise, while he had secretly ignited a new war. In their eyes, Charles Stuart ceased to be a misguided monarch. He became a man of blood, responsible for the deaths of thousands. Before marching to war, the army officers held a prayer meeting at which they swore that if God granted them victory, they would call Charles Stuart, the man of blood, to account for the blood he had shed. The Second Civil War was short but fierce. Cromwell, at the head of his veterans, marched rapidly north and in the Battle of Preston in August 1648 utterly defeated the numerically superior Scottish army. By autumn, all uprisings had been suppressed. The army returned to London victorious and determined to see the matter through to the end. While the army was fighting, the Presbyterian majority in Parliament, frightened by the soldiers' radicalism, resumed negotiations with Charles I. They were prepared to make any concessions to reach an agreement with the king and use his authority against the army. For the army leaders, this was the final straw. They saw it as a pact with the devil, a betrayal of everything for which blood had been spilled. On December 6, 1648, as MPs returned to Westminster, Colonel Thomas Pride and a detachment of soldiers blocked the entrance to the House of Commons. Holding a list in his hand, he expelled or arrested all members known for their sympathy toward the king and the negotiations. This military action went down in history as Pride's Purge. About 140 Presbyterian MPs were expelled. The remaining minority, some 60 or 70 radicals, derisively called the Rump, was entirely under the army's control. The path to the trial of the king was opened. Cromwell, who returned to London after the final victory, initially appears to have hesitated. The idea of putting God's anointed to trial was monstrous and unheard of for the age, violating every conceivable law and tradition. But pressure from the army and his own conviction that Charles was a man of blood who must be punished by God's command prevailed. He concluded that this was the only possible path ordained by Providence. For him, the execution of the king was not a political act, but the fulfillment of divine will, a terrible yet necessary sacrifice to cleanse the land of shed blood. In January 1649, the Rump Parliament established a High Court of Justice to try the king. The charge was revolutionary. Charles Stuart was accused not of violating specific laws, but of high treason, of maliciously waging war against his own people and Parliament. This was the first attempt in history to condemn a monarch in the name of the nation. The trial began on January 20th in Westminster Hall, an ancient chamber that had witnessed coronations and trials for centuries. The atmosphere was tense. King Charles I conducted himself with great dignity and courage. From the outset he refused to recognize the court's legitimacy. "I would like to know by what authority I am here," he asked the judges. "I am your king, bound by the laws. I have God and tradition by which I must stand for the freedom of my people." He understood that he was defending not only his life, but the very principle of monarchy. He turned the dock into a throne. The judges, including Cromwell, Puritan, and other army leaders and MPs, were unsettled, but there was no turning back. The proceedings lasted several days. Witnesses testified to the king's role in starting the war. On January 27th, the court delivered its verdict. Charles Stuart, as a tyrant, traitor, murderer, and enemy of the English people, was sentenced to death by beheading. The death warrant was signed by 59 judges, later known as the Regicides. Oliver Cromwell's signature stood third. According to legend, as he signed, he was in a state of nervous excitement, laughing and smearing ink on a neighbor's face, perhaps a way of coping with immense psychological strain. The execution was set for January 30th, 1649. That morning was bitterly cold. Charles asked to wear 2 shirts so that he would not shiver from the cold, and so the crowd would not think he trembled from fear. He bade farewell to his younger children, who remained in England. Around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, he was led on to the scaffold erected outside the banqueting house in Whitehall. A vast crowd silently filled the square. Due to the soldiers' cordon, almost no one heard the king's final speech. He again proclaimed his innocence, and said he died a martyr for the people. He then offered a short prayer, laid his head on the block, and gave the signal. With a single blow of the axe, his head was severed. The executioner's assistant raised it for the crowd to see. Instead of cheers, eyewitnesses reported a single prolonged groan from the crowd, a sound of horror, shock, and perhaps remorse. The execution of the king stunned all of Europe. It was a point of no return. The monarchical order, long thought unshakable and divinely ordained, had been destroyed. England became a republic, or as it was officially called, a commonwealth. But this republic was born in blood and violence, and its future was uncertain. And the man more responsible than any other for this deed, Oliver Cromwell, now bore the full weight of what had been done. He had destroyed the old order. Now he had to build a new one. Removing the king brought England neither peace nor stability. The newborn Commonwealth found itself in a hostile environment. Monarchist Europe was horrified by the unprecedented act of regicide. Within England, the Royalists were suppressed but not eliminated, and divisions among the revolution's supporters deepened. The Leveller movement demanded immediate implementation of the agreement of the people and the extension of voting rights to broad segments of the population. Cromwell and the other grandees, seeing these ideas as a threat of anarchy and to the sacred right of property, brutally suppressed several soldiers' mutinies, alienating many former supporters. The greatest threat, however, came from abroad. In Ireland, after Charles I's execution, various factions, the Catholic Irish Confederates, who had been fighting for their rights since 1641, and Protestant English Royalists, temporarily set aside their differences and united against the English Parliament. They proclaimed Charles II, son of the executed king, as their monarch. Ireland became the main base for a possible royalist invasion of England. At the same time, in Scotland, shocked by the execution of a king from the House of Stuart, the Presbyterians also recognized Charles II as their monarch, albeit under strict conditions of adherence to the Covenant. The Republic was caught in a vice. It was decided to strike first, and the first target was Ireland. In August 1649, Oliver Cromwell, as Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, landed in Dublin at the head of a 12,000-strong expeditionary force. He came to Ireland not merely as a general, but as an avenger and an instrument of divine justice. For him and his Puritan soldiers, the Irish Catholics were not simply enemies, but barbarians, idolaters, and above all murderers responsible for the massacre of Protestant settlers in 1641. In his eyes, this was not a war, but a punitive expedition. The first target was the heavily fortified town of Drogheda, whose garrison consisted of English royalists and Irish Confederates. Cromwell offered the garrison the chance to surrender, but was refused. After a powerful artillery bombardment breached the walls, the new model army launched its assault. The defenders put up desperate resistance. When the city was taken, Cromwell issued the order that became the darkest stain on his reputation: no quarter was to be given. Not only the soldiers of the garrison were killed, but also all men found bearing arms, as well as all Catholic priests. Hundreds of people who had taken refuge in St. Peter's Church were burned alive when the soldiers set the building on fire. Approximately 3,500 people were killed. In his report to Parliament, Cromwell wrote without a shadow of doubt, "I am persuaded that this is a righteous judgment of God upon these barbarous wretches, who have so long imbrued their hands in blood. I am confident that it will tend to prevent the effusion of blood in the future, which is what I most earnestly desire." He sincerely believed that this cruelty was justified, as it would save lives in the long run by breaking the will to resist. From Drogheda, Cromwell marched south toward the town of Wexford. There, history repeated itself, though with some differences. During negotiations for surrender, Cromwell's soldiers burst into the city and carried out a massacre in which about 2,000 soldiers and hundreds of civilians were killed. The brutality at Drogheda and Wexford did indeed have its effect. Terror of Cromwell's army compelled other towns to surrender without a fight. Within 9 months, Cromwell subdued most of eastern and southern Ireland. In May 1650, he handed over command to his sons-in-law Puritan and Ludlow and returned to England, where a new threat awaited him. The Irish campaign ended in the total defeat of the Irish, the mass confiscation of Catholic land, and its redistribution to English soldiers and adventurers. For Ireland, this was a national catastrophe, the memory of which endures to this day. The next threat came from Scotland. Charles II, seeing the failure of the Royalists in Ireland, accepted the humiliating terms imposed by the Scottish Presbyterians. He travelled to Scotland and, with great reluctance, publicly swore allegiance to the Covenant, effectively becoming a Presbyterian king. Scotland began raising an army to invade England with the aim of restoring the monarchy. The English Parliament decided to act preemptively. The Commander-in-Chief, Thomas Fairfax, unwilling to invade religiously allied Scotland, resigned. His place was taken by Oliver Cromwell, who became Lord General of all the armed forces of the Commonwealth. In July 1650, Cromwell led the English army into Scotland. The Scottish forces were commanded by the experienced General David Leslie. He adopted the correct tactic, avoiding decisive battle and luring the English deeper into his territory while creating a scorched earth zone. Cromwell's army suffered from disease and shortages of food. By the end of August, the English were trapped near the coastal town of Dunbar, pressed against the sea by Leslie's army, which was twice as large and occupied the commanding heights. The situation seemed hopeless. Cromwell wrote that he had never experienced such pressure, but at the decisive moment the Scots made a fatal mistake. The Committee of Covenanters, composed of radical ministers and nobles, distrusting Leslie's professionalism and believing victory already assured, forced him to move the army down from the impregnable hills onto the coastal plain in order to destroy the army of sectarians once and for all. Watching this maneuver through a spyglass, Cromwell exclaimed, The Lord hath delivered them into our hands. On the night of September 3rd, under cover of darkness and rain, he regrouped his forces and struck at dawn. The Scots were taken completely by surprise. The Battle of Dunbar became a triumph of Cromwell's military genius. His outnumbered army utterly defeated the enemy. About 3,000 Scots were killed, and 10,000 taken prisoner. As always, Cromwell attributed the victory solely to divine intervention. Yet the war was not over. Charles II, with the remnants of his army, made a desperate move. In the summer of 1651, he invaded England, hoping for a mass royalist uprising. But the English people, weary of war, did not support him. Cromwell, leaving part of his forces to complete the conquest of Scotland, rushed in pursuit. On September 3, 1651, exactly 1 year after Dunbar, the armies of Cromwell and Charles II met near the city of Worcester. This was the final battle of the English Civil War. Cromwell's army, vastly superior in numbers, won a complete and crushing victory. Cromwell himself called it his crowning mercy. Charles II narrowly escaped. After 6 weeks on the run, hiding in the famous oak tree and disguising himself as a servant, he managed to flee to France. By the end of 1651, the whole of Britain, England, Scotland, and Ireland had been united by force of arms under the authority of the English Parliament. Cromwell returned to London an absolute victor, the most powerful man in the country. The wars were over. It was time to build peace. And this task proved far more difficult than winning any battle. With the end of the wars, a fundamental question confronted Cromwell and his associates. How was the country to be governed? Formally, power belonged to the rump of the Long Parliament, but it was only a fragment of the former representative body, devoid of authority and legitimacy in the eyes of the nation. The victorious army looked upon the parliamentarians with open contempt, viewing them as corrupt and ineffective politicians who delayed reforms and lined their own pockets. Cromwell himself grew increasingly disillusioned with Parliament. He urged the MPs to hold new elections and dissolve themselves, but they stalled, fearing the loss of power. Cromwell's patience snapped on April 20, 1653. That was the moment of the scene with which we began our story. Bursting into Parliament, he dismissed the MPs with the words, "In the name of God, go!" This act was, in essence, a military coup. All power in the country fell into the hands of Cromwell and the Council of Officers. Yet Cromwell was not a conventional dictator thirsting for personal power. He was a sincerely religious man, tormented by the search for the best form of government pleasing to God. In the summer of 1653, he undertook a unique experiment. Instead of elections, he and his officers appointed a new legislative body of 140 men, selected for their piety and religious zeal from lists provided by independent churches. This assembly entered history as the Parliament of Saints, or, after one of its more colorful members, the leather merchant Praisegod Barebone, hence the name Barebone's Parliament. Cromwell believed that these godly men could build a just society. The experiment failed spectacularly. The saints proved incapable of constructive work. They split into moderates and radicals, the latter seeking to abolish tithes, reform common law, and even eliminate universities as breeding grounds of sinful secular knowledge. After 5 months, recognizing its own incapacity, the moderate majority voted for self-dissolution and returned all power to Oliver Cromwell. Army leaders concluded that experiments had to end. The country needed a stable and strong executive authority. A group of officers led by General John Lambert drafted the first and only written constitution in English history, the instrument of government. According to this document, England, Scotland, and Ireland were declared a commonwealth, headed by a Lord Protector for life with extensive powers. Legislative authority was vested in a unicameral parliament, elected on the basis of a high property qualification. Executive power was shared between the Lord Protector and a Council of State appointed by Parliament. On December 16, 1653, Oliver Cromwell was solemnly proclaimed Lord Protector. The era of the Protectorate began. Cromwell became, in effect, an uncrowned monarch. He moved into the royal palace at Whitehall. He was surrounded by splendor comparable to that of a royal court. Yet his rule was full of contradictions. On the one hand, he sought healing and reconciliation for the nation. After long years of war, he carried out important reforms, put finances in order, and reorganized the judicial system. In religion, he pursued a policy of relative toleration. The Anglican Church was effectively dismantled, but members of various Protestant sects, Independents, Baptists, Quakers, were granted freedom of worship so long as they did not disturb public order. He even allowed Jews, expelled from England in the 13th century, to return and establish a synagogue in London. Catholics and Anglicans, however, remained outside the law. On the other hand, his regime rested on military force. Parliaments convened under the instrument of government proved no less defiant than their predecessors. They challenged the Protector's authority and sought to revise the Constitution. Cromwell was forced to dissolve them, making his rule increasingly authoritarian. In 1655, after a series of royalist plots, he resorted to an extreme measure, dividing the country into 11 military districts, each headed by a major general with extraordinary powers. The major generals not only maintained order but also enforced morality, closing taverns, banning cockfighting, bear-baiting, theatrical performances, and other sinful entertainments. This regime of Puritan dictatorship made the Protectorate deeply unpopular among the population. Cromwell's foreign policy was far more successful. He sought to restore England's greatness on the international stage and create a powerful Protestant alliance against Catholic powers. His reorganized and strengthened navy, commanded by the brilliant Admiral Robert Blake, defeated the Dutch, England's main commercial rival, in war. He then launched a war against Spain. England seized Jamaica in the Caribbean, marking the beginning of its colonial empire, and destroyed the Spanish Silver Fleet. Cromwell compelled Europe to respect and fear England. In 1657, the Second Protectorate Parliament, seeking greater stability and a return to traditional forms of government, offered Cromwell what seemed unthinkable: the crown. The question tormented him for weeks. On one hand, a coronation would legitimize his power in the eyes of most Englishmen and ensure succession. On the other, he had fought against monarchy and executed a king. How could he now wear a crown? Moreover, his old army comrades fiercely opposed the idea, for whom the word king was synonymous with tyranny. After long and painful reflection and prayer, Cromwell refused the crown, declaring, "I cannot undertake this government with the title of king." However, he accepted a new constitution, the humble petition and advice, which restored a second chamber of Parliament, the House of Lords, and granted the Protector the right to appoint his successor. His power became even more monarchical in everything except name. He was king de facto, if not de jure. The final years of Cromwell's life were darkened by anxiety and disappointment. He had reached a pinnacle of power he had never imagined, yet failed to create the godly and stable order he desired. The regime depended entirely on his personality and the strength of the army. He stood alone at the summit. Many old friends and Republican allies turned away from him, accusing him of betraying the ideals of the Revolution and usurping power. A nation weary of Puritan strictness and military rule grumbled. Financial problems mounted. Cromwell appeared exhausted and aged. The heaviest blow came with the death of his beloved daughter Elizabeth Claypole in the summer of 1658. He was inconsolable. His own health, undermined by years of campaigning and immense strain, rapidly declined. At the end of August he took to his bed with a bout of marsh fever, probably malaria, apparently contracted in his youth in the marshy fens. He died as he had lived, with unshakable faith in God. He sought comfort in Scripture, and asked his chaplain whether a man who had once known divine grace could ever finally fall from it. Receiving a negative answer, he said, "Then I am safe, for I know that once I was in grace." He had no doubt that his soul would be saved. Before his death, he named his eldest son Richard as his successor. Oliver Cromwell, Lord Protector of England, Scotland, and Ireland, died in the afternoon of September 3, 1658, the anniversary of his greatest victories at Dunbar and Worcester. To his supporters, This was a sign of divine favor. To his enemies, a sign that the devil himself had come to claim his soul. At the moment of his death, a terrible storm broke over London, one of the fiercest of the century. People whispered that nature was mourning the death of a great man, or that evil spirits were fighting for his soul. He was buried with splendor surpassing that of any English monarch. His embalmed body, clothed in royal garments, lay in state at Somerset House and was then interred with a grand procession in Westminster Abbey, among the tombs of English kings. It seemed that his dynasty was firmly established, but this was an illusion. The system he created was too closely tied to his personal authority. His son Richard Cromwell was a kind and virtuous man, but lacked his father's talents and authority. He could not control the army, which once again began to intervene in politics. The protectorate collapsed in less than a year. Anarchy followed. In this situation, the elite and a population exhausted by chaos saw only one solution: the restoration of the monarchy. General Monk, commander of the army in Scotland, marched into London and organized elections for a new parliament, which immediately invited Charles II to return from exile. In May 1660, Charles II, son of the executed king, triumphantly entered London. With the Stuart Restoration began an era of revenge. The surviving regicides were captured and executed by hanging, drawing, and quartering. But the most symbolic revenge was reserved for the dead protector. In January 1661, on the 12th anniversary of Charles I's execution, the bodies of Oliver Cromwell, his son-in-law Henry Puritan, and Judge John Bradshaw were exhumed from their graves in Westminster Abbey. They were dragged on sledges through the streets of London to the execution site at Tyburn. There, their corpses were hanged on gallows until sunset. Their heads were then cut off and their bodies thrown into a common pit. Cromwell's head was placed on a long spike and displayed atop Westminster Hall, the very building where he had tried the king and ruled the country. It remained there for nearly a quarter of a century, a gruesome reminder of the time of the Great Rebellion. So who, then, was Oliver Cromwell? History has never given a single, definitive answer. Over the centuries, his image has changed beyond recognition. For royalists and supporters of monarchy, he was a bloody tyrant, a hypocrite, a usurper who destroyed the lawful order. For radical Republicans of the 19th century, he became a hero, a champion of liberty and parliamentary rule, a founding father of British democracy. For the Irish, his name remains forever synonymous with a brutal conqueror and religious fanatic, responsible for mass killings and national humiliation. He was undoubtedly a man of profound contradictions, a simple country squire who became one of the greatest military commanders in English history, a devout Puritan who spilled rivers of blood, a fighter against the tyranny of one man who became an absolute dictator, a defender of Parliament who dispersed it by force, a regicide buried with royal honors. Perhaps the key to understanding Cromwell lies in his unbreakable, almost fanatical faith. He sincerely believed himself to be an instrument in the hands of God. This faith gave him the strength to crush enemies, execute a king, and rule a nation. But it also blinded him to the suffering of those he regarded as God's enemies, and deafened him to the arguments of those who saw the world differently. He was a man of his age, harsh, passionate, deeply religious. He tried to build the kingdom of God on earth, as he understood it, but in the end created a military dictatorship rejected by his own people. And yet his legacy is immense. Though the monarchy was restored, it was never the same. The ideas for which the Long Parliament fought, the supremacy of law, the accountability of the king to Parliament, the inviolability of subjects' rights, took root in the nation's political consciousness. The glorious revolution of 1688, which finally established constitutional monarchy in England without bloodshed, was in many ways the completion of the work begun in 1640. Cromwell proved by force of arms that royal power was not absolute, and no English king after him ever again dared to rule without Parliament. He remains one of the most complex, controversial, and influential figures in world history, a man who rose from obscurity to overthrow a 1,000-year-old monarchy, unite Britain by force, and compel all of Europe to reckon with his will. His shadow still hangs over Britain, reminding us of those turbulent times when a simple gentleman from Huntingdon, guided by faith and the sword, forever changed the course of history. His life was an unending drama of power, faith, cruelty, and the tragic attempt of a man to build a perfect world on an imperfect earth.